This is an ad by BetterHelp. What are your self-care non-negotiables? The things you know make you feel better even when it's impossible to make time for them. Like that workout you try to squeeze in between kids' activities, work, and everything else you have going on, and before you know it, it gets pushed to tomorrow. Sound familiar? But it's the moments when you feel like you have no time for yourself when those non-negotiables are more important than ever. Those are the things that keep you strong, healthy, motivated, and prepared to take on everything life demands of you. So why not make therapy one of them? BetterHelp Online Therapy makes it easy to get started with affordable phone, video, or live chat sessions you can do from anywhere, and the option to message your therapist between sessions if anything comes up. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com.
History as it happens, September 17th, 2024. Election of 2008.
While devastated giants like Citigroup get bailed out again and again and again, many smaller banks are failing.
Do you believe the economy is contracting right now?
Our estimates are that we're slightly growing at the moment, but we think that there's a chance that for the first half as a whole, there might be a slight contraction.
As a result of these conditions, we experienced a significant cash outflow, which reduced our liquidity pool dramatically.
It is sometimes difficult to understand what Senator Obama has said, because as soon as he is confronted on it, he says that's not what he meant.
The time for us to ask how we were going to get out of Iraq was before we went in. And that is something that too many of us failed to do.
Barack Obama, the senator from Illinois, the junior senator from Illinois, has won the Iowa caucuses.
Somehow in Washington today, and I'm afraid on Wall Street, greed is rewarded, excess is rewarded.
You can actually see Russia from land here in Alaska.
I'd rather lose an election than see my country lose a war.
We are here because we love this country too much to let the next 4 years look just like the last 8.
An unforgettable campaign in a dark year, 2 failing wars compounded by the subprime mortgage crisis, and the most sudden economic downturn since the Great Depression. It ended on a historic note, the election of the first black president, but with unsettling omens for our politics. Did the hope and change last? That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
To start with, what I think is most important about the 2008 election is it is the first time that an African-American man was able to put together a movement not only to run for President Martin, but to unseat the presumptive Democratic nominee, Hillary Clinton, someone who had all the advantages in 2008 in the primaries, and then a win against a war hero in John McCain.
And I can see Russia from my house.
Why does 2008 seem so long ago, like a different lifetime politically, and in some ways a different country? The first election of a black president generated soaring optimism about the future of a country mired in a scary economic crisis, the subprime mortgage meltdown, after 8 regrettable years of the George W. Bush administration. The global war on terrorism was a fiasco that stained U.S. prestige, and don't forget the botched response to Hurricane Katrina. Yet amid these troubles, many Americans, especially younger voters, were elated about the possibilities.
We meet at one of those defining moments, a moment when our nation is at war, our economy is in turmoil, and the American promise has been threatened once more. Tonight, more Americans are out of work, and more are working harder for less. More of you have lost your homes, and even more are watching your home values plummet. More of you have cars you can't afford to drive, credit cards, bills you can't afford to pay, and tuition that's beyond your reach. Now, these challenges are not all of government's making, but the failure to respond is a direct result of a broken politics in Washington and the failed policies of George W. Bush.
Barack Obama defeated John McCain in a landslide, 365 to 173 in the Electoral College, and by 10 million in the popular vote. After an exhilarating campaign year, There were no incumbents on the ballot, and Obama began 2008 as a long shot, facing Hillary Clinton in what would prove to be a bruising Democratic primary.
Senator Barack Obama started this day in the lead, and he said his opponent did not get the game changer she would need to grab the momentum.
And thanks to you, it's full speed on to the White House.
Senator Hillary Clinton told cheering supporters in the West Virginia Capitol she will not give up her fight for her party's nomination.
I am more determined than ever to carry on this campaign.
Then I promise you this, we will not just win Maryland, we will win the Democratic nomination, we will win the general election.
On the Republican side, Arizona Senator John McCain emerged from a crowded field that included Mitt Romney and Rudy Giuliani. But McCain's most memorable move was his choice of running mate, little-known Alaska Governor Sarah Palin.
I love those hockey moms. You know, they say the difference between a hockey mom and a pit bull? Lipstick.
And Palin turned out to be the best thing to happen to Saturday Night Live in years. This is the next installment of my monthly election series, and we are less than 2 months until the 2024 election. I don't sense excitement as I did back in 2008, more like a sense of dread. But I will share links to past episodes in this series in my weekly newsletter. You can sign up at historyasithappens.com or search for History As It Happens on Substack. So 2008, much of that America feels like it's gone. I mean, the transition from Barack Obama to Donald Trump was so stark and jarring that millions of Americans are still reeling from it. There are continuities, of course, important ones. The fallout of the free trade regime embraced after the end of the Cold War was evident then and is still rocking our politics today. The consequences of failed forever wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that were a big part of the 2008 campaign, well, they're still being felt today, too. It is impossible to explain the rise of Donald Trump without reference to these facts. In fact, Trump is a part of Obama's legacy. Jeremi Suri is a historian at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. He hosts This Is Democracy podcast, and he is the co-author of the daily Democracy of Hope on Substack. Welcome back, Jeremi Suri.
Good to be with you as always, Martin.
You know, I've been enjoying these election shows we've been doing. At one point I said, the closer we get to present day, the easier it is to see why the election we're discussing is relevant. But you know what, I was thinking maybe that's not true because, well, you're a historian. You know that sometimes you need more time, right? More time has to pass before you can really evaluate the significance of an event. Why does this election still matter today? Has enough time gone by where we can assess its significance?
I actually think it might be the most relevant election, 2008 or 2012, for the election we're having this year. What happens this year will in many ways, just to your point, affect how we view 2008. Was Obama's election a fluke? Is it one of those things that happened once and will not happen again for a long time, that someone like that will get elected president? Or was it actually a harbinger of what we might see this year? There are a lot of parallels between the Barack Obama and Kamala Harris candidacies. But to start with, what I think is most important about the 2008 election is it is the first time that an African-American man was able to put together a movement not only to run for president, Martin, but to unseat the presumptive Democratic nominee, Hillary Clinton, someone who had all the advantages in 2008 in the primaries, and then a win against a war hero in John McCain, who was the Republican nominee. And that is quite an extraordinary achievement. We take it for granted now. And it transformed our political landscape. On the one hand, for some people, it opened up a possibility for a different kind of person to be leader. And like my kids, for example, grew up with Barack Obama as the first president they ever saw. So this to them seemed like a normal thing. But it also sparked a backlash that was already evident during that election and certainly evident in the years after with the formation of the Tea Party immediately thereafter. And you could see Sarah Palin's vice presidential run, which I'm sure we'll talk about, as in a sense a harbinger of the far right, just as Barack Obama was a harbinger of the new Democratic Party.
In retrospect, things can seem inevitable because Obama won on election night so convincingly. But looking back on it now, he was a surprise. As you just said, Hillary Clinton went into the primaries the favorite. He'd only been in the Senate for 2 years. He had given a rousing speech at the 2004 Democratic National Convention. He wasn't a U.S. Senator yet at that point, was he?
No.
No. So, yeah, he was a state senator.
He flew into Chicago from Springfield, Illinois.
Tonight is a particular honor for me because, let's face it, my presence on this stage is pretty unlikely. My father was a foreign student, born and raised in a small village in Kenya. He grew up herding goats, went to school in a tin roof shack. His father, my grandfather, was a cook, a domestic servant to the British. But my grandfather had larger dreams for his son.
2 years later, he's in the Senate. 2 years later, he's the president. We have a lot to get into here about the relevance of that 2008 period, whether we're still living in that time or not. Since you brought it up, what explained Obama's, the sensation that he was in such a short period of time?
Well, I think the most significant event in the rise of Barack Obama was the Iraq War. In 2004, John Kerry ran against George W. Bush, supporting the war in Iraq. Both candidates supported the war, and Hillary Clinton, who was a senator at the time, also supported the war. Barack Obama was one of the few candidates on the Democratic side who, because he had been in office for such a short period, had not been tainted by the war. So his 2 years in the Senate, rather than 8 years in the Senate, meant he wasn't there when the key decisions were made after 9/11. And so he wasn't tainted by that. He could be an opponent of the war, and he could promise an alternative vision of the United States. What Obama ran on for white voters as well as African-American and other voters was the promise of turning away from the over-militarism of the post-2001 period and turning back to the problems at home. Civil rights one among them. Barack Obama did not run as a critic of American capitalism. He actually ran as a supporter of American capitalism, saying we were fighting a war that was harming us at home, and that became most evident during the recession that occurred at the same time as the campaign. And so it was a return to basics, a return to domestic issues, versus the problems of foreign policy. And to some extent, that was a replay of the election in 1992 between Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush.
And the thing about Obama's coalition that is still hard for some people to understand, to your point about the importance of domestic issues, by the time November 2008 rolls around, because the Lehman Brothers went down in September of that year, and we're going to get to that, the acceleration of the financial crisis and then the horrible recession that hit a couple of months before the election, really, although it had been brewing for a long time. People who were in Obama's coalition moved away from Democrats 8 years later and voted for Donald Trump because many of those same issues were still, the sting had yet to wear off.
It's true. And one of the striking things, there's so many differences between Barack Obama and Donald Trump. The differences overwhelm the similarities. But one similarity is that both Barack Obama and Donald Trump were critical of the war in Iraq. And many, shall we say, small-town voters in places like Michigan and Wisconsin who felt the economy was pulled out from under them due to the recession, due to the war, want to see America first. And in a certain way, that's what both of these candidates were saying.
NAFTA, the issues, the underlying issues that all of a sudden after 2016, everyone realized, this is why middle-class Rust Belt Americans are so unhappy. Those issues were there, but I guess we weren't talking about them in quite the same way. I guess this is one of the failings in Obama's legacy, that he didn't deal with this more during his 8 years. But we're talking more about the election now. I guess my question to you here is, I've been trying to think about how much of that world of 2008 are we still in? Those issues were there. Forever wars, the Rust Belt, deindustrialization, economic dislocation. But 2016 was such an earthquake.
Well, I think what 2016 reminds us as historians is that change moves in two directions at the same time. History does not just move in one direction. It is because we had become a more diverse country between 2008 and 2016, with more American citizens born overseas than ever before. more immigrants coming to the United States than we had seen since the late 19th century. For those reasons, and those were part of the Obama movement, you had a backlash in the Donald Trump movement. And I think of 2008 and 2016 elections as two sides of the same coin. It's dialectic in Hegelian terms, to be fancy, right? Which is to say that we're moving in these two directions and one side feeds off the other. So the desire for diversity, the desire to embrace an America that, like my state of Texas, is majority-minority, and high technology, highly educated, a knowledge economy, that's part of what the Democratic Party was doing under Obama, and it worked in 2008. Obama was elected not just with the votes of minorities, but with the votes of upwardly mobile white men and women with college education. That sparked a reaction among those who felt left out, left behind, who were former Democratic voters in some cases, who now felt that in a post-NAFTA world, in a post-recession world, they were stuck in low-end jobs with reduced standards of living.
Social media. 2008 was the first Facebook election, but I don't recall social media being a poisonous force in 2008.
No, what it did, though, I think, was
good for fundraising for sure, but go ahead, yeah.
Right, so that's where I was going to go. I did create microfinancing and of campaigns, and that was one of the pioneering things that David Plouffe and other advisors of Barack Obama did. They leveraged this new social media and web access to get lots of small donors to give money and to aggregate small money. In the primaries, in the Democratic primaries, Hillary Clinton had locked up all the big money. What Barack Obama did was he raised $5, $10, $15 from hundreds of thousands of people, and he continued to do that through the election, and it gave him an enormous advantage in money and in enthusiasm. And that became a model. Again, if we're talking about the world of today, this is exactly what Donald Trump has done. So are the Democrats now doing this. Kamala Harris is doing this very effectively. But for a while, it was Donald Trump who, by selling his wares online, was able to multiply his donations, often from very modest donors.
And to your point about the backlash, I really want to touch on that as we deal with more of the broad brushstrokes here before we drill down to some of the specifics of that crazy year. You know, this stuff has been around really going back to Reagan's time, but the far-right fringes were marginalized. We had other priorities during Reagan's time. The Cold War was still on, etc. And I think Reagan kept some of these forces at arm's length within the Republican Party. After he's gone, after George H.W. Bush loses re-election in 1992, Pat Buchanan, Newt Gingrich, the rise of right-wing cable news, we're moving along now towards present time. That, I guess you might call it the dark underbelly of American politics, the paranoid style. There was a moment in 2008, it was late in the campaign, where John McCain is holding a town hall, and a woman stands up and says, "I don't like Barack Obama, he's an Arab."
I got to ask you a question. I do not believe in, I can't trust Obama. I have read about him, and he's an Arab. He is not. No?
No, ma'am. He's a decent family man, citizen that I just happen to have disagreements with on fundamental issues, and that's what this campaign is all about.
You talked about the Tea Party, too, which was like a paranoid movement as well.
Yeah,
but the birther movement, right? That Barack Obama is some kind of foreign, not really American element in our political life.
Donald Trump was part of that, of course,
right.
Actually. So it's a direct connection. And it's the oldest of all historical tropes, that people who look different are not really Americans. The 14th Amendment, which, of course, provides natural-born citizenship, that anyone born here like myself is a citizen. That's the law, but that's not accepted by a lot of people. And very quickly, those who look different will be called non-citizens. And that's exactly what Donald Trump and others were doing from the very beginning of Barack Obama's run for the presidency, especially when it looked like he might get the nomination from Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side. The argument was made that he was not a real American citizen, that he had to show his birth certificate, all these things. And it wasn't really about Barack Obama. It was about the alleged anti-Americanness or non-Americanness of people who look different. And I have to say, it is directly connected to the current nonsense being spewed by people about Haitian immigrants in Ohio. Again today, Ohio, that city of Ohio has had to close its schools because of recurrent threats from people out of state who think that there are Haitian refugees there who are eating dogs and cats. There's no evidence that's ever occurred, just as there's no evidence that Barack Obama was anything but an American citizen. But these rumors carry weight with people because of the way someone looks. And that was a big part of Republican mobilization. John McCain had a problem in that he was highly regarded by people. But even within the Republican Party, there was not a lot of excitement or enthusiasm around him. The enthusiasm was on the far right. And so he, although he was correcting the mistakes as a man of honor that were made around him, he also had to play to those beliefs. And that's why he chose Sarah Palin as his vice presidential running mate. And she was flat and center in that birther movement, far right extremism that was brewing at that time.
Yeah, she'd be perfect today. The create your own reality, ignorance as a badge of honor stuff. We'll return to Palin in a moment. There was also this charge against Obama that he was a socialist, that his policies were going to fundamentally transform the country, and he was scary to a lot of people for that reason. Now, his policies were as middle of the road, people call it corporate democratic, candidate today. Neoliberalism is another word gets thrown around a lot. Bottom line, he was not a socialist. But that was also part of this paranoid style on the far right in those days.
He has all of the earmarks of a Marxist dictator. He does. He doesn't like anybody to challenge him. He launches into, instead of answering any questions, he just launches into a diatribe. Stern 25-minute defense on how wonderful Obamacare is.
There were two tropes of that kind. One was that he was a socialist, yes, and that he was going to take away private property, et cetera, which, of course, couldn't be further from the truth. But then there was also the black power trope, which was that, he was part of this radical fringe. There was a very important moment in the campaign when a minister who he and Michelle had visited quite often, Jeremiah Wright, who had been a kind of family minister for them for a while, was quoted as saying some things that were deemed to be hateful and deemed to be radical.
Yeah, radical.
And Obama, I think, reluctantly, but nonetheless, renounced Jeremiah Wright. He had to do that. He was fighting against the view that he was a socialist and the view that he was some black power radical. I remember, Martin, the New Yorker magazine had a cover during that campaign where they had Michelle Obama dressed as a black power radical with a big afro and everything from the 1960s, clearly playing to that fear. And Michelle Obama was part of that story. We think of her as a beloved figure now. As she reflects in her memoir, she was treated as this, radical black power person through much of the campaign by Republicans.
And there was a lot of ugliness there, and not just during the general election. We're going to get to Obama versus Hillary in a bit. But another question I ask in all of these election shows, what was the state of the country in 2008? Because the state of the country determines the outcome of the election more often than not. 1932 is a perfect example of that. It's easy to forget because, I talk a lot about and think a lot about foreign policy, as you do, that even though the Iraq War was a disaster and was very unpopular, by the time people are getting ready to cast their votes in November 2008, we are faced with a scary, scary domestic situation.
It was actually one of the most difficult economic periods I can remember in my lifetime. Far more difficult, honestly, than now. And from an economic point of view, far more difficult than COVID. The American economy was in free fall. What had happened was years and years of over-leveraged, or what we might call financial bubbles around real estate, had led to a situation where banks were overextended in their loans and couldn't cover the debt that was owed to them when the indebted individuals didn't have property worth what the debt was due. And so as a consequence, we had the equivalent of bank and business failures only seen before then in the Great Depression. And the reason it didn't go that far, I think, was because we had institutions in place since the Great Depression, like the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation that protected our savings, unemployment insurance, that kept us from going down that route. And then in late 2007, the George W. Bush administration, pressured by Democrats, Nancy Pelosi and others, invested in a series of domestic emergency spending measures that went against all their fiscal conservatism, but in essence bought the auto industry, bought much of the insurance industry, kept those parts of the country running. And the George W. Bush administration deserves credit not only for doing that, but for working in a bipartisan way with Democrats and with the incoming Obama administration. All of this was happening while this election was going on. It was almost as if every week the economy went a step lower, a step worse.
Yeah.
And it certainly helped Obama, because even though McCain was not the man in the office, his party, the Republican Party, had been in power, and they were blamed with.
Yeah, and McCain would say, I watched some of the debates from that year, I've been against a lot of what my opponent, Obama, says he's against, but I've been in Congress for a very long time, and I've been talking about these problems for a while.
I also warned about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and warned about corporate greed and excess and CEO pay and all that. A lot of us saw this train wreck coming.
It is true that the foreclosures really accelerated in 2007 because of these subprime mortgages. This is a new term to a lot of people in those days, mortgages that were given to people who really probably should not have gotten a loan to buy a home. But that really wasn't the full trigger. It was when we realized the banks had been commodifying and bundling these mortgages.
That's right.
And in 2008, I'll just give you an example here. In 2008, Bear Stearns is in huge trouble. There's the fire sale of Bear Stearns. Announces major liquidity problems and is granted a 28-day emergency loan from the New York Fed. Investors are fearful the firm's demise could spark a collapse of the financial sector. So this is in March of 2008. 2 weeks later, in early April of 2008, Ben Bernanke went before Congress to testify. He was asked by Chuck Schumer, New York senator, do you think we might be in a recession this year? And Bernanke wasn't sure.
A recession is possible, but a recession is a technical term defined by the National Bureau of Economic Research, depending on data which will be available quite a while from now. So I'm not yet ready to say whether or not the U.S. economy will face such a situation.
Now, we know what happens next, so that answer he gave seems like, what is this guy talking about?
Right.
Because in September is when Lehman Brothers went under. The Bush administration decided not to bail out Lehman Brothers. Just weeks later, AIG was about to go under.
Yeah.
And they did bail out AIG. That really wasn't a question, Jeremy, but that series of events, it really gets worse in 2008. And then from September of 2008 is when the real disaster sets in and we have what's called the Great Recession.
In retrospect, it does seem so obvious, but at the time, I remember it felt more like a cascading flood. It just got worse and it just got worse and worse, and you didn't really understand what was happening. We were fortunate, though, that we had someone like Ben Bernanke as chairman of the Fed, who had actually been a scholar of the Great Depression.
Yes.
And although his testimony was not always prescient, the Fed did step in. And some would argue, and this is the argument that Rand Paul and others have made, right? In some ways, the Fed overstepped its jurisdiction to come in and put cash and capital into the economy. We went into a liquidity crisis because the banks were going out of business and there was no money available.
Yeah, we don't have time to get into the causes and the consequences of the 2008 crash, but needless to say, we are still living with that legacy today. There is still a lot of lingering resentment among, and rightfully so, among working class people who lost their homes. You remember that slogan for the Occupy Wall Street movement? You bailed out Wall Street, not Main Street.
Yeah. There's an argument. There's an argument to that. And I think that actually was the policy, the belief that the Bush administration and then the Obama administration had, and McCain would have done the same thing in this, is that you had to keep the large pillars of the American economy standing, the auto industry. And later on in 2012, Obama would criticize Mitt Romney for not wanting to bail out the auto industry, the insurance industry, all of these basic elements of American society, because they employed so many people. And because they had so many knock-on effects to other parts of the economy. The people who were not helped were those who lost their homes, right? Who took out a mortgage they couldn't cover, or lost their job when their company went out of business and then couldn't cover their mortgage and lost their homes. Most of them never recovered from that. And those become, in some ways, some of the Trump voters.
It was a scary time. As you said, we didn't really understand at the time what was happening or when it would stop. I didn't even mention that the government nationalized Fannie and Freddie, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the lenders, in September of 2008. The justification given for not bailing out Lehman Brothers is that it would create moral hazard, but then they did, as I mentioned, bail out AIG. The realization was if we don't start intervening here on a truly unprecedented scale, we will have the complete collapse of the financial system.
That's right. And AIG was particularly important because they were one of the largest insurance holders, not just in the U.S., but in Asia and elsewhere. And the concern was exactly that you were going to see the economies of the world go into more of a tailspin. which would be very hard to get out of. It took us years to get out of this. I mean,
the recovery was slow. It was not great.
Obama is not incorrect to say the criticisms of the economy under his leadership were criticisms that were not fair because he was cleaning up someone else's mess.
John McCain decided to put his presidential campaign on hold to go back to Washington to deal with the financial crisis. In retrospect, was that a smart idea? Because he didn't seem to benefit from this issue.
No, I think he was trying to show that he was serious, and he was serious, right? So he was trying to show that, but I don't think it didn't help his campaign. I'm not sure it hurt his campaign. I think he was in a terrible situation. His party had made many of these problems, or was at least in power when these problems came to the fore. He was associated with them, and because he had been in Congress for so long, it was hard for him to escape responsibility. Obama had the virtue in this case of not having been in Congress very long and not responsible for these policies.
And he talked about how the crisis was the result of 8 years of, he kind of generally or vaguely described it as a form of trickle-down economics, of deregulation. But you know this, Jeremy, and I know you recently read Nelson Lichtenstein's book about the Clinton years. The deregulation, financialization of the American economy goes back to the post-Cold War 1990 period.
Absolutely. I mean, Exhibit A would be the Glass-Steagall Act, which goes back to the Great Depression. The Glass-Steagall Act had been put in place to limit the risky investing of banks, distinguishing consumer banks from investment banks. It was the Clinton administration that repealed the Glass-Steagall Act, which allowed banks to start bundling mortgages in the ways you just described, Martin, which gave us the subprime crisis. And you have this silly thing of like community banks investing in this, high-flying property all around the world that they lost money on.
Yeah, they had no idea what they were actually getting themselves involved in with these bundled up securities that were, well, when the bottom fell out, right, that was it.
I think it's Michael Lewis who writes, right, you had garbage leveraged on garbage, and no one could actually identify where the real garbage was anymore.
That's a better way of putting it. So I guess in the final analysis, would you say, when it comes to this issue, that it benefited Obama?
Enormously. Obama was able to run at a time when the economy was failing and the war in Iraq was doing a little better, but still failing in the eyes of most. And he was able to promise one thing. And this is what his whole campaign was about, change. But he was promising change from a man who seemed reasonable, not radical, believable. He was a moderate centrist in so many ways, or at least he came across that way. And that made people feel comfortable with him as a change candidate.
We are at a defining moment in our history. Our nation is involved in 2 wars, and we are going through the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. And although we've heard a lot about Wall Street, those of you on Main Street, I think, have been struggling for a while, and you recognize that this could have an impact on all sectors of the economy. And you're wondering, how's it going to affect me? How's it going to affect my job? How's it going to affect my house? How's it going to affect my retirement savings or my ability to send my children to college? So we have to move swiftly, and we have to move wisely. And I've put forward a series of proposals that make sure that we protect taxpayers as we engage in this important rescue effort. Number one, we've got to make sure that we've got oversight over this whole process. $700 billion potentially is a lot of money. Number two, we've got to make sure that taxpayers, when they are putting their money at risk, have the possibility of getting that money back and gains if the market and when the market returns. Number three, we've got to make sure that none of that money is going to pad CEO bank accounts or to promote golden parachutes. And number four, we've got to make sure that we're helping homeowners, because the root problem here has to do with the foreclosures that are taking place all across the country. Now, we also have to recognize that this is a final verdict on 8 years of failed economic policies promoted by George Bush, supported by Senator McCain. A theory that basically says that we can shred regulations and consumer protections and give more and more to the most, and somehow prosperity will trickle down.
Yeah, he wasn't there's no such thing as an anti-war president in the United States. He wasn't an anti-war president. He was against the Iraq War, although he wasn't in the Senate at the time where he might have had to cast a vote for it, as Hillary Clinton did. I have the audio of that.
This is a very difficult vote. This is probably the hardest decision I've ever had to make. Any vote that might lead to war should be hard, but I cast it with conviction.
Obama was against Iraq for Afghanistan, or fixing Afghanistan,
Correct.
which he thought was the more important of the
Correct.
two.
His criticism of the Bush administration, which stung, was that they were expending resources in Iraq when the real problems were elsewhere. And this is after the 9/11 Commission report and a great deal of other evidence proving what we all knew, which was that Iraq had nothing to do with the 9/11 attack. And most of the terrorists, in fact, hated Iraq almost as much as they hated the United States. So Barack Obama's point was actually he was going to be a more effective fighter of the war on terror.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Democratic primary. This was an amazing race, and it got really nasty. I forgot about some of these things. You know, we've had 10 years of nastiness in this Trump era, if you want to call it that. The nastiness isn't just monopolized by one side here either. I think our entire political climate has gotten really ugly. I was surprised to go back and just be reminded of how nasty the Obama-Hillary Clinton stuff got. What was going on there?
Well, Hillary Clinton resented the fact that this newcomer was challenging her. She felt entitled to the nomination. She had been a senator from New York after, of course, serving as First Lady. She was highly regarded in the party. She believed that she was the best person on policy, and she had the policy background that Barack Obama did not have. She perceived Barack Obama as exploiting the difficult situation she had been in, having to vote on the war in Iraq and things of that sort. And so she thought she had been the tough decision maker and that he was being unfair to her.
What about racial undertones or overtones? Didn't Bill Clinton at one point say something like, or compare Obama to Jesse Jackson?
I do think he did that and then apologized quickly thereafter. But
as in, he's a sideshow, he's not the real deal.
I want to be light touched on this, but there is a long-standing tension in American history between women's activists and African-American activists. They often work together, but sometimes they perceive a trade-off. So many suffragists were not supporters of African-American civil rights because they believed that suffrage issues had to come first, and vice versa. And so I do think there was a little bit of that. I wouldn't say that was the main element, but I think Hillary thought it was time for a woman to be elected, and that a woman should be elected before a black man should be elected.
Yeah, I don't think Clinton's attacks on Obama were very effective. On the healthcare issue, for instance, they spent a lot of time debating that over many, many weeks and months during that primary season.
Barack Obama was a compelling speaker, and he was able to make his case.
Yeah.
And she had some challenges. And I think that's actually, though, where she suffered the other side of what I was just saying. I think it is harder in some ways to run as a woman than as an African-American male or an Asian male. There is a presumption of male leadership and male authority. And it's difficult for women on a stage to assert authority without appearing, especially to men, as being too aggressive. That's the space that she was in, and it also wasn't helped by her husband, Bill Clinton, who didn't come across as the most nurturing husband either. And so this was a difficult situation for her to be in. I think, as Hillary Clinton has herself said, it's taken a long time for women to figure out and for the American public to accept women as leaders in our society. And that's not the fault of Hillary Clinton.
And I caught a clip of Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama debating, and some of these squabbles are like petty in retrospect.
Yeah.
Clinton had accused Obama of praising Ronald Reagan.
When Senator Clinton or President Clinton asserts that I said that the Republicans had better economic policies since 1980. That is not the case.
It is sometimes difficult to understand what Senator Obama has said because as soon as he is confronted on it, he says that's not what he meant. The facts are that he has said in the last week that he really liked the ideas of the Republicans over the last 10 to 15 years.
That is not true. What I said, and I will provide you with the quote, what I said is that Ronald Reagan was a transformative political figure because he was able to get Democrats to vote against their economic interests to form a majority to push through their agenda, an agenda that I objected to because while I was working on those streets, watching those folks see their jobs shipped overseas, you were a corporate lawyer sitting on the board of Walmart.
You talked about Ronald Reagan being a transformative political leader. I did not mention his name.
Your husband did.
Well, I'm here. He's not.
Okay, well, I can't tell who I'm running against sometimes.
I think we both have very passionate and committed spouses who stand up for us, and I'm proud of that.
It was much uglier. The attacks from the far right on Obama were much uglier than the Hillary Obama stuff.
It's true, but I do think one thing that came through in the primary that helped Obama was he was able to hone a message as a change candidate. And that was really what was exciting for many people who supported him. And Hillary Clinton was coded much more as the established candidate. And that carried over to running against John McCain also.
And today, it's not good to be part of the establishment or an incumbent, not just here, but across the world. How important, we'll get to McCain and Palin in a minute, how important was it for Obama to win the Iowa caucuses?
If it weren't for Iowa, and I think Obama has said this himself, and David Axelrod has too, if it weren't for Iowa, we wouldn't know his name right now.
Wow.
He would have been just another candidate. He came out of the box in a state that you didn't expect him to do so well in. And the thing about the Iowa caucuses is they don't just reflect the votes, they reflect personal impressions because it's communities of people coming together to vote. It's not secret ballot. It showed that he had a charismatic appeal for, quite frankly, Midwestern white people that a lot of others didn't expect, and it showed Hillary's weakness. So it is in some ways similar to the early primary contests in 1968, when Lyndon Johnson, the presumptive Democratic nominee, was bested or close to bested by Eugene McCarthy. It showed the weakness of Lyndon Johnson. This showed the weakness of Hillary Clinton.
The delegate count coming out of Iowa was 16 for Obama, 14 for John Edwards, 15 for Hillary Clinton. So it wasn't like a landslide, if you will, but these caucuses are different than a...
Well, it's all about expectations, though. Yeah. I mean, Barack Obama was not supposed to be there. Was not supposed to even be in the top 2 or 3. Everyone knew John Edwards, right? He had been John Kerry's running mate. It made sense that he did reasonably well. This was before the revelations of felonious behavior on his part. But the fact that Obama did that well, again, it's like Eugene McCarthy almost winning in New Hampshire against Lyndon Johnson in 1968.
Joe Biden got 4% in the pre-caucus poll. I'm just looking at some of the other people who were in contention in those days. Bill Richardson, Christopher Dodd, Dennis Kucinich. So on the Republican side, let's get to that part of the story. There's another structural thing here I'd like for you to address before we dig into the specifics. Running as, well, the incumbent party, John McCain was not an incumbent. And I guess that's one thing that made this election so exciting. You had no incumbents. But running as a Republican in a year after 8 years of Republican governance that were disastrous for the country, John McCain was up against it.
I agree. His appeal to many Republicans was he was the things that George Bush wasn't. He was a serious policy guy. He was a war hero. He was a strong supporter of the war on terror, but promised to prosecute it differently. And people forget this, he had a very, very conservative voting record at home. Later on, in later years, that will soften. But at that point, he was one of the most conservative voting senators on social issues, from guns to school vouchers to anti-abortion. He fit that mode well. He was an ideologue and a policy wonk and a war hero. And I think in a weak field, he stood apart from others.
Senator Obama said the surge could not work, said it would increase sectarian violence, said it was doomed to failure. Recently on a television program, he said it exceeded our wildest expectations. But yet, after conceding that, he still says that he would oppose the surge if he had to decide that again today. Incredibly, Senator Obama didn't go to Iraq for 900 days and never asked for a meeting with General Petraeus.
Well, let's go at some
Senator
of these things.
Obama is the chairperson of a committee that oversights NATO that's in Afghanistan. To this day, he's never had a hearing.
What about that
point? It's remarkable.
He's about 70 years old, 69, 70, I think, when he was running for president. It was his age.
Spring chicken for president.
He was too young. Was his age an issue? I mean, I think Obama made it an issue, yeah.
A little bit. It was less that he was old, but more that Obama was young and exciting.
Yes.
It's sort of like when Kennedy ran against Nixon. They're actually not that different in age, but Kennedy seemed so much younger, so much more youthful, and you had that with Obama. And I remember, the Obama campaign would intentionally show images of him playing basketball and doing these things. I don't think that was just about McCain's age, by the way. There was also about McCain's war injuries. I mean, McCain was physically challenged as a consequence of his heroic efforts to save himself and his fellow prisoners of war.
He was tortured. He was tortured by the North Vietnamese, yes.
He had limited use of one of his arms. There were a number of things, and that made him a hero, but it also limited the youthfulness and energy that he could convey.
So, Jeremi, you live in Texas. Can you see Mexico from your home?
I can see all the way to Venezuela.
You know where I'm going here. Sarah Palin and Tina Fey.
And I can see Russia from my house.
And, I've been thinking about this situation a little bit differently in preparation for this episode. Why Sarah Palin? Where did McCain find her?
She was not the person who I think McCain really wanted to choose based on who he'd like to have as a vice president. And he himself had doubts about her capabilities, but he was behind in the polls for all the reasons we discussed. He recognized he was running a campaign with a lot of disadvantages. And so he needed something to shake things up. And most of all, he needed and wanted to charge up his conservative base. He understood, as we've talked about before, that elections are won not really by those in-between voters. They're won by getting your people out as fully as possible, right? Yeah. And he had to do that. And so when you're behind, you try something new, right? You put in the backup quarterback, right? You try something new, and that's what he did. And she turned out to be far worse than he had expected. It was a calculated risk that backfired.
She obviously didn't know what she was talking about, and her interviews were embarrassing. But to her supporters, the way she was criticized made them like her even more. I mean, we see that now with the Trump effect, right? Yeah. It's like a badge of honor. Those elitists, the establishment, all they can do is make fun of us and mock us.
Yeah, and I think that's true, but I think she alienated more voters than she attracted, because it was not only that she was ill-prepared, it was that she seemed not to want to be prepared. And I think
or just she was defiant when she was criticized for not knowing what she was talking about.
Precisely. This is an important point, right? You can get a lot of short-term accolades by attacking the establishment, but Americans still want you to have something to say that you're going to do. They still want a policy position. She had trouble articulating, beyond the one-liners criticizing others, she had trouble articulating a coherent vision of her own.
Her syntax was torture. I mean,
her syntax was torture. Her reasoning was hard to recognize at times. And there was a novelty about her for a while, and then it grew old very fast.
Tina Fey did a skit on Saturday Night Live where they didn't actually write any lines. They just took what Palin had said and had Tina Fey repeat it. This kind of word salad about something. And for those of you who may not remember, Palin was interviewed by Charlie Gibson, ABC. What does your proximity to Russia as the governor of Alaska, how does that help your foreign policy credentials? No governor has foreign policy credentials. You're a governor. You're not dealing with national policy. She didn't say I could see Russia from my home, but
you can actually see Russia from land here in Alaska.
And it wasn't just that she said that. It was that she had nothing else smart to say. Other than that, again, her appeal was that she was the hockey mom. We all, when we take our kids to sporting events, there is someone interesting with one-liners, often ranting about one thing or another, who's kind of fun to be around at the end of the day. Maybe you'll go and have a beer after the hockey game. But as you think about it, it's not actually the person you want.
Yeah. Katie Couric asked her, what are some of the other Supreme Court rulings you disagree with? Because Palin disagreed with Roe versus Wade. She had no idea, could not name a single one.
Well, let's see. There's, of course, in the great history of America, there have been rulings that there's never going to be absolute consensus by every American. And there are those issues, again, like Roe v. Wade, where I believe are best held on a state level and addressed there. So, going through the history of America, there would be others, but...
Can you think of any?
Well, I would think of any, again, that could best be dealt with on a more local level. Maybe I would take issue with, but, as a mayor and then as a governor and even as a vice president, if I'm so privileged to serve, wouldn't be in a position of changing those things, but in supporting the law of the land as it reads today.
Kind of like I do with my questions. They're word salads.
Not at all. Your questions are ingeniously disguising the direction that you want to go.
So on Election Day, I guess it really wasn't that suspenseful. Obama, 365 electoral votes. John McCain, 173 electoral votes, so he doubled him in the Electoral College. 69 million votes for Obama, 59 million for McCain. Look at some of the states that are considered critical to win today. Pennsylvania went to Obama. Florida went to Obama. North Carolina went to Obama. Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota. Well, that always goes Democrat. I meant to say Michigan, Wisconsin. That's the so-called blue wall, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, Obama did very, very well. I think this is the last time a Democrat won Florida. He did not win Arizona, which is interesting. The Sun Belt was still more solidly Republican. He
and
won
McCain's
Colorado and New
home
Mexico.
state, so there.
And that's McCain's home state, fair enough. But he basically won the Northeast, the Upper Midwest, the West Coast, and then a smattering of states elsewhere and Florida. And that turned into a big electoral victory and a big popular vote victory. It was a mandate. And the night of the election, pretty early in the night, he was able to go with his family to Grant Park in Chicago, infamous for the protests in '68. But now where there was this extraordinary rally for a new America, a new post-racial America. That's what people were saying. That's what people were predicting. And I just want to recount one of my brightest memories from this period. I was a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison then. My kids were very young. They'd been born in Madison, where I was a professor then. We were home with the kids, but I could look outside and watch on local television my students and students throughout the university of all kinds of backgrounds went outside to rally after Obama's victory. And Martin, these kids started singing the national anthem. It was a patriotic moment. There was this sense, at least among a lot of people, obviously not everyone shared in the exultation of the victory, but there was a sense not only that Obama had won, but that this was a new idealistic moment for our country, that we were going to come together and we were going to realize the ideals. I think when they were singing the national anthem, it was similar to Martin Luther King quoting from the Declaration of Independence. There was a statement, we're going to realize these dreamed ideas of equality and freedom for all that we haven't until this time. It was such an idealistic moment. It's so hard to remember today because we're so far from it.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're going to wrap up on that note. You know, we started talking about at the top of this podcast, what parts of that world are still with us today? Well, one that isn't is a result like this. 365 electoral votes to 173. I don't know when we're going to see a landslide again. This coming election is going to be very close, I suspect. But also that notion that we were on the precipice of a new era, hope and change, things could fundamentally change based on this really emotional appeal. Barack Obama had a charisma and an emotional appeal, especially to younger voters. But not that much changed. Barack Obama did win, President Obama, a Nobel Peace Prize. I think he bombed, I don't know how many countries he wound up bombing as commander-in-chief, and he escalated the war in Afghanistan, at least for a short time.
Absolutely.
And on the domestic front as well, because when you come in with so much optimism and hope, that slogan, I don't like slogans, but I mentioned it before, bailing out Wall Street, not Main Street. We're still living with the consequences of that today.
I agree, and I think there are some things that you can blame Barack Obama for and his supporters and some things you can't. What you can blame him for, not just overselling change, but underestimating the resistance to change and expecting more consent. Even when you win a big victory in American society, Ulysses Grant learned this. Abraham Lincoln learned this. Theodore Roosevelt learned this. We have always been a society, a pluralistic society with different points of view. And it's hard to get things through. And Congress is not designed to easily pass lots of legislation. And so I think he was, because of his lack of experience, this is a point Nancy Pelosi makes in her memoir, he was a little naive on those issues, not quite prepared. But to give him credit, he inherited a real mess. And so while there was hope for change, there was a lot of structural work that needed to be done at home and abroad. And then he also had, in Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, or Senate Minority Leader at the time, a commitment to making him a one-term president. He didn't find the leverage against McConnell. I blame him for that. But I also think we have to recognize that McConnell and the Republicans didn't want him to succeed. So I would say Barack Obama needed a little more Lyndon Johnson. But he needed also a little more bend from the Republicans. And so both sides really made each other worse after this.
His first 2 years in office, when he did have the votes in Congress, he got through the health care reform.
Correct.
But there was a
without
backlash.
a single Republican vote. Yes. The Affordable Care Act had 0 Republican votes. That's extraordinary when you consider how popular it is today.
Although they did participate in the amendment process and the hearings at a time when Congress used to hold hearings before passing major pieces of legislation.
Good point.
Yes.
Good point.
This is our moment. This is our time to put our people back to work and open doors of
giving me a fair hearing.
This is our moment. This is our time to put our people back to work and open doors of opportunity for our kids, to restore prosperity and promote the cause of peace, to reclaim the American dream and reaffirm that fundamental truth that out of many we are one, that while we breathe, we hope, and where we are met with cynicism and doubt and those who tell us that we can't, we will respond with that timeless creed that sums up the spirit of a people. Yes, we can. Thank you. God bless you. And may God bless the United States of America.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, well, it's going to be the topic I was supposed to discuss today, but sometimes the schedule gets twisted around a little bit. Coming up next, what was the Biden doctrine? What does a president have to do to have a foreign policy doctrine named after him? That is next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.